Thank you for joining us tonight, everyone. Just going to give a couple more minutes to let everyone else join us. Okay, let's get started. So welcome and thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Alexis. I'm an adult services librarian here at the Hudson Library. And I'm very excited to introduce tonight's author, Tomlinson, who's here to discuss his book, Dogland, and give us all an insight into the world of competitive dog shows. Copies of the book are available for purchase at Hudson's independent bookstore, The Learned Owl. And I'll be putting a link in the chat to purchase a book from their website if you're interested. Will also be time tonight for a Q&A. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout the duration of the program tonight using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. And now to introduce our author this evening. Tomlinson has spent 23 years as a reporter and local columnist for the Charlotte Observer, where he was a finalist for the 2005 Pulitzer Prize. He's written for several other publications, including Esquire, ESPN the Magazine, Sports Illustrated, and Forbes, among many others. He is the host of the podcast Southbound and is also the author of a memoir titled The Elephant in the Room. So thank you so much for being here tonight, Tommy.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And thanks everybody for coming out virtually. There's I always tell people there are a lot of things you could be doing on this night. So I'm glad you came to see me. And so what I want to do a little bit is talk about my new book, Dogland. I don't like to give big speeches, so I will just talk for a little while about some things about the book. What I really like is to interact with the audience. So as Alexis said, if y'all have questions, things you want to know about the dog world or the book world or whatever, feel free to drop them in there and we'll talk until they run us off tonight. So thanks so much for coming again. So Dogland, the title, is the way I started to see the whole world of dog shows and kind of the bigger world of dogs and the people who love them. The dog show world is sort of this traveling carnival that goes from town to town. Every weekend in America, there are multiple dog shows in multiple cities all over the country. And it's kind of like, the deadheads that would go from town to town following the Grateful Dead around. There's this group of people in RVs with dogs in crates and, what they call X-pens, exercise pens, packed in the back of the van, all going around from city to city. And all that culminates in the Westminster Dog Show, which is sort of, in America at least, like the Super Bowl of the dog show world. And that's going to be in New York in just a couple of weeks from now. And so I spent about 3 years in this kind of traveling theme park that I call Dogland. And I just want to talk a little bit tonight, before we get to your questions, about a few things I've learned from being a part of Dogland for a while. So the first thing I learned is that show dogs are really kind of built different than regular dogs. So when a litter is born to two purebred dogs, and the breeders come in and look at the puppies, usually this is about 6 weeks old. They separate them into two categories. The puppies that they think have the qualities, the physical qualities in them that might become champion show dogs one day, they are put on one side and they're called show quality. And the dogs that don't quite measure up by that standard. They're put in another batch, and they're called pet quality. Pet quality is actually a little bit of a dig in this world. But from that moment on, the show dog quality dogs and the pet quality dogs live very different lives. Show dogs are trained differently, fed differently, housed differently. They travel a lot more, and just in every way, their lives, by and large, for a few years that they become show dogs, are just very different than what a normal dog's life is like. And there are certain qualities, I think, in show dogs that become apparent after you watch them for a while. And I want to read just a quick little excerpt from the book where I talk about this. So at this point in the book, this is pretty early on, we're at the 2022 Westminster Dog Show, and they're doing what they call the breed judging. So dog shows, there are 3 rounds. First of all, every dog of the same breed is judged against each other. So like all the Airedales are together, all the Pomeranians are together, and then they pick what they call best in breed. Then those dogs of about 200 breeds are sorted into 7 groups. And those are predetermined groups, kind of based on what they used to do for a living, the size and that sort of thing. The winner of those 7 groups then go on to compete for best in show. So you end up with 7 dogs competing for the title. But at this point in the book, we're still at the breed judging. So here's a little bit about that and the dog that sort of becomes the star of this book. The rule of thumb for breed judging is 2 minutes per dog. With 26 dogs, it'll take about an hour to whittle down the Samoyeds. For the dogs and their handlers, most of that is waiting. Striker, who's the main dog in the book, is fantastic at waiting. Most of the other dogs keep looking up at their owners, waiting for scritches or treats. Striker seems to barely notice what's going on. When Laura, his handler, tells him to be still, he stares off into the distance. His normal stance is an almost perfect stack, the kind of pose that it could take a show dog months to learn. One of the defining traits of a Samoyed is something called the Sami smile. The theory goes that as the breed evolved in the bitter Siberian winters, the corners of its mouth began to turn upward so its drool wouldn't leak out and freeze. People talk about their dogs smiling all the time, but the Samoyed is one of the only dogs that can actually form a smile, even with its mouth closed. What that means when Striker is standing still and staring into the distance is that it looks like he's reliving a fond memory, like a choice piece of steak or an especially pleasurable hump. He takes quick, short breaths that make him look like he's nodding to an EDM beat, like oons, 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 oons. That's a part of show quality too. Most of the dogs that win dog shows aren't jumpers in and out of the ring. They have an inner stillness that I tend to associate with people who are either enlightened or empty-headed. Al McGuire, the great college basketball coach, used to say he didn't like really smart players. They were too aware of the crowd and the noise to play with the proper focus. This is not to say Striker isn't smart. It's just to say he probably would have made a hell of a point guard. So that's one thing I learned in Dogland is that champion show dogs sort of have not just different physical traits, but different sort of emotional and personality traits than what we think of as our normal pets. Another thing I learned is that the movie Best in Show, which was this mockumentary about the dog show world, is actually not that far off. That movie was made almost 25 years ago now. And if you go back and watch it, one thing you'll notice is that there actually is a lot of detail that they get right. They hired professional dog handlers, judges, people like that to do a facsimile of a dog show. And so if the sound's off and you're not, following the dialogue, it looks and feels very real. Now, of course, the action there is exaggerated for comic effect. And Best in Show is one of those things that still sort of raises some hackles in the bubble of the dog show world. Some people still haven't quite gotten over it yet. But the reason I think is that it's largely true. There are a lot of sort of strange rituals in the dog show world. They use a different language than everybody else. They see their calling as this sort of highfalutin thing. In the world of dog shows, the people who are involved in it, they call themselves the fancy. So you know that phrase, like you fancy somebody, that's where it comes from. It's the fancy. And so they are literally see themselves as sort of fancier compared to the day-to-day world of dogs and dog people. And so that manifests itself in a lot of ways. There were a lot of dog show people when I started to do interviews for my book who wanted nothing to do with me, either because they felt like they had been burned by Best in Show, or they just didn't think that an outsider like me could ever fully understand what their world was like. So there are a lot of little rituals, a lot of superstitions. So Striker, the dog I just mentioned, Striker and his handler Laura King are sort of the champion dog and handler that sort of provide the narrative thread to the book. Striker had a lucky towel that Laura picked for him at the beginning of every show. And so every time they went out of the ring, they took Striker's lucky towel with him for that round. And so if he kept winning, of course, they kept taking the towel out there until it got kind of gross and nasty, but they would keep it out there because that was the lucky towel, right? And so these kinds of superstitions, the language, the rules and regulations in the dog show world, they're all part of what make it this really fascinating subculture. And I think subcultures are fascinating in themselves. That's why I wanted to write about dog shows, because I think actually it's not that different than a lot of other subcultures. So if you're a big NASCAR fan, for example, or you like to knit, or you love to fish, or whatever it is, all those things, all those pursuits have their own language, their own little culture, their own kind of rules and regulations. And many of them kind of look down on people from the outside. The dog show world is most definitely like that. And so it was interesting to me to see that Best in Show sort of got it right. The third thing I learned from being in Dogland is that there's not a lot of money in it. I think people think that dog owners, champion dog owners, are like the owners of champion horses, where they could put the horses out to stud or to breed and make millions and millions of dollars. You know, the Kentucky Derby is this weekend. The winner of that gets millions of dollars. Not the dog show world. The champion of Westminster, the biggest, most important dog show in America, gets a couple of trophies and a ribbon. That's it. There's no money. There's nothing else but the prestige of being the champion of Westminster. And at smaller dog shows, the champions usually get just like a ribbon and a sack of dog food. Now, there is some money to be made in breeding champion dogs, but it's not nearly the money that you think about with like horse breeding or other things like that. And so it led me to ask people who are involved in it, like, why do you do this? Because most people who do it go into the red to have a champion show dog, to turn it over to a handler and let that handler run what they call a campaign, which is 3 or 4 years out on the road, could cost like hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And most of the people in this world are not independently wealthy. So when I asked why they did it, there were two answers that I thought were pretty compelling. One is that just consider if you had a small child, like an 8-year-old, who showed themselves to be really brilliant, let's say at tennis. They had a big forehand and they could beat all the other kids, all the other 8-year-olds in the state. You might spend a lot of money sending that kid to some tennis academy where they would be away from you for a long time, where they might be lonely or might have a very different life than other kids their age, in hopes that they might become a champion one day and that all that hard work and loneliness would pay off down the road. That's one thought. Another thought that I think is maybe a little closer to the truth, a dog handler told me early on in this, is that think about it as owning a really great piece of art. So a champion show dog is unique in the world. If you have that dog, nobody else in the world has that dog. You get to take it out with you and show it around, like taking a painting or sculpture to different galleries and letting people see it. And everybody in that world knows that that piece of art, that show dog, belongs to you. And I think as I talk to a lot of dog handlers and dog owners, that argument, that thought became pretty interesting and pretty accurate to me. I think these people see dogs, among other things, as these great objects of beauty. And a dog show is a way to display these works of art to other people who have great appreciation for them. The fourth thing I learned in Dogland, and this is kind of where the book takes a turn in some ways from like the really fun, lighthearted, happy stuff to maybe a little deeper thought, is that one of the many things dogs teach us is how to say goodbye. So there are a lot of goodbyes in this book in various forms between dogs and their handlers, dogs and their owners, and so forth. I talked to some celebrity type folks who have lost dogs in one way or another. And there's a chapter in this book that's a more personal story about the dog, Fred, an old yellow lab mutt, who my wife and I had for almost 15 years and loved very deeply. Dogs teach you a lot of things. And I think one of the things that happens when you have a dog is you may not think about this consciously when you get one, but it becomes clear pretty quickly that unless it's a very odd situation, you're probably going to outlive that dog. And so you have to come to terms with something you love leaving you in some way. And so I think dogs have this great gift for showing us how to live our lives in a lot of ways. They show us how to be happy, which is kind of what, in a bigger picture way, the whole book is about. They show us how to live in a more free and open and curious and loving way. And I think they show us when the time comes how to say goodbye. And that I think becomes a really important lesson for us as we as we get older, saying goodbye to humans we love in our lives. Dogs kind of are, in some ways, a great dress rehearsal for those moments. The final thing I want to talk about before we get to the questions is about the last thing, and I think one of the most important things I learned in Dogland, and that is that we invented dogs and they kind of invented us. So the first part of that is absolutely clear. There was no such thing as dogs before we created them. Every dog that has ever existed, from the tiniest teacup chihuahua to the biggest Neapolitan Mastiff, and every mixed breed mutt in between, are all descended from gray wolves that humans domesticated somewhere up around 30,000 years ago. We tweaked the genes of those wolves by breeding them and crossbreeding them and rebreeding them and doing all those things to create the dogs we wanted, which at the beginning of this journey that we took together, dogs were sort of like power tools. You know, we used them to pull sleds, to kill game, to protect us from predators. They did hard physical manual labor. Some dogs still do that now, not as many. What most dogs are for now, as I say in the book, I have a chapter that's called "They're All Therapy Dogs." And these days, no matter what the dog was originally conceived for, most dogs are our companions. They're our housemates, our friends, are the ones who listen to us when we're down, the ones that we think sometimes understand us when nobody else does. And so every step along the way, as we have tweaked dogs' genes and needed dogs to do different things, they have enabled us to do different things. They enabled us to quit being nomads and to make homesteads and farms and households. They enabled us to move into factories because the ones who were left behind and not working in the factories, they were companions and helpmates to the people who started to move into neighborhoods and that sort of thing. And now, as many of us have become nomads of a different sort, a lot of young people who move from job to job, from town to town, and maybe the only tangible thing they take with them from place to place is that dog that they love. They enable us to cope with a very different modern lifestyle. So, as I said, we clearly invented the dog, and I happen to think that the dog is mankind's greatest invention, better than the wheel or fire or any of those sorts of things. But also along the way, I think it's important to understand that in a very real way, dogs invented us. And what you see in front of you when you look in the mirror is in part a creation of all the dogs that have ever existed. In the same way that dogs are in some way have the thumbprint of every human that's ever existed. We have been side by side now for 30,000 years, and we are part and parcel of each other. So that's sort of the speech part of the program. I would love to hear your questions about dogs, dog shows, whatever you like. Please fill up the Q&A or the chat or whatever, and I'll answer any questions. And Alexis, if you want to pick some out and read them to me, I'll be glad to answer.
Yeah, it looks like we have one already. Someone was wondering if you're deciding on getting a dog, do you think going to a local dog show, looking at all the breeds and talking to the owners or handlers of those breeds, is a good idea? Do you think people could learn from that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a ton of resources out there for potential dog owners to figure out which dogs would fit them well. In fact, if you look at, I think a good start is to just go, like you said, go to a dog show, talk to some of the handlers about breeds, ask them, how they might fit your needs. Like some dogs are really good with children, other dogs aren't. Some dogs are really good indoors, other dogs aren't. They'll tear up your couch. You know, some dogs need a ton of exercise. So if you're a person who's indoors a lot all day or is not home a lot, that dog may not be good for you. Dog handlers and people like that certainly know all those things, but you don't have to go to the dog show to learn that stuff. So the American Kennel Club is a great resource for this sort of thing. And if you see a breed that you particularly like, then you should go to the American Kennel Club website, and they have basically a dossier on every single dog breed, and there are 200 or more now. And one of the things they list there, they actually have like a numerical ranking of like is good with children 1 through 5, needs lots of attention 1 through 5, those sorts of things. And so you can sort of calibrate to your needs what kind of dog you might get. But I should also say, to answer that question, that you don't have to get a purebred dog at all. There are tons of dogs in shelters today who are in great need of homes, who are loving, caring dogs. Many shelters will let you foster a dog, which is just like take it home for a couple of weeks to see if it's a good fit for you. All those sorts of things. During the pandemic, excuse me, a lot of people got dogs because everybody was sort of isolated and they needed a companion. After the pandemic, a lot of those people gave those dogs back. And so the shelters are really full these days. And so I would suggest that not only do you go to a dog show and do research on purebreds, but you also go to the shelter and talk to those folks there. They can answer a lot of the same questions you have about whether a particular dog might be good with kids or, needs indoor space or outdoor space or whatever. And those dogs are, by and large, incredibly appreciative of people who bring them home.
There is another question asking about how Best in Show is judged and how they mention a particular dog that had won, Matissa Porty, um, the year that it had won the most in dog show, best in shows. It was beat by a beagle, and so they were wondering how that happens and kind of if you could explain the judging process.
Sure. So that happens quite often, actually, where a dog that wins a lot of shows during the sort of a regular dog show circuit might not win best in show. And there's several reasons for that. But let me kind of back up and talk about how the judging works. So there are 3 rounds at every dog show. Like I mentioned before, dogs are judged within their own breed and then in several groups. And then the last 7 dogs are judged in the best in show round. Um, the judges at each level are supposed to have a wider knowledge of dogs. So, for example, if the Samoyeds, like Stryker, they're all judged by somebody who's supposed to be an expert in Samoyeds. Well, when they get to the group level, there's like maybe 25 to 30 breeds. At the group level, the judge is theoretically supposed to be expert in all those breeds. And then when it gets to the last 7, the best in show, the judge for that is supposed to be conversant in every dog breed. I'm a little skeptical if that's actually true, but they are certainly supposed to know a lot about a lot of different breeds of dogs. There's never been a big scandal, as far as I know of, involving dog judges, but there is a lot of subtle pressure that dog judges get, or a lot of nudging they get to pick certain dogs. And that happens through the dog show trade magazines. There are 3 big trade magazines that everybody in the dog show world gets. And those magazines, which usually come out every week, are stuffed to the brim with advertisements for the top show dogs. And so these big glossy photos, Stryker had some too. And it would be like Stryker and his handler and a big glossy photo and then a thank you to the judges who had picked them best in show at earlier shows. And so the theory is that when it got to like a big show and the judges might not know all the dogs very well, they might remember seeing one of these dogs in a magazine and might pick that dog over another dog for that reason. Now that's a kind of a subtle influence. It's not like handing a judge, $1,000 or whatever, but it is a way to kind of like in their mind subconsciously get a judge to do one thing or another. But I'll tell you the other part of this that was interesting to me, and I didn't know it all before I got to this. When they get to say the final 7 dogs, and there's a bloodhound and a Pekingese and a beagle and whatever. Those dogs, we always think of those dogs as being judged against one another. And technically, that's not the case. What they're supposed to be judged against is the written breed standard for that breed, which can sometimes run to thousands of words and describes in minute detail basically the perfect version of that dog breed. So, for example, for the Samoyed, there's like a 2,000 word breed standard that lists a range of height they're supposed to be, what their hair is supposed to look like, how thick the fur is supposed to be, what their legs are supposed to be shaped, all these sorts of things, and all these other things that would disqualify a dog as a champion if they have the wrong color hair, the wrong color eyes, or all these sort of weird esoteric examples. So when a judge judges a dog, he or she is supposed to be judging that dog against that breed standard. And the dog that wins is theoretically supposed to be the most like perfect version of itself. So it's not really the bloodhound versus the Pekingese or whatever. It's how close does the bloodhound come to the ideal bloodhound versus how close does the Pekingese come to the ideal Pekingese. Now, does a dog show judge at Best in Show at Westminster know the breed standards for 200 different breeds of dogs? I sincerely doubt it. And so they are judging on more esoteric things, more practical things like how much energy a dog has, how much charisma it might have, how it works with its handler going around a ring and that sort of thing. So there's a technical way that dog shows are supposed to be judged and a more practical way they're supposed to be judged. And I think what happens there is often the dogs that win smaller shows where maybe the technical aspects are more important. And they get to the bigger shows where there's 200 breeds being judged at once. And those other kind of, non-technical details might make more of a difference.
We have another question about just general, if you learned anything about the health of a dog show dog versus pets, pet standard, as they say.
Yeah,
Um, and if you could talk about that a little bit.
sure. So here's something that kind of sounds counterintuitive at first. The average mutt will probably live longer and in many ways lead a healthier life than your average show dog. Here's the reason for that. Show dogs are purebreds. And what that means in practice is that they're inbred. So generation after generation, the bloodline of these dogs gets narrower and narrower and narrower. And so you're basically at this point with most dog breeds, it's inbreeding. It's cousins and cousins and grandparents and grandchildren and all that sort of thing that we don't like to think about very much, especially not in humans, but it's pretty common in the animal world. But they tend to call it line breeding or something like that in the fancy because they don't want to sort of fess up as much that it's inbreeding. But it is. The problem, the upside of that is that by the breed standard, you get a more and more perfect dog that meets that breed standard to a T. The downside of that is that inbreeding, just like in humans, exacerbates any medical problems or genetic problems that a dog might have because it never has a chance to get bred out. And so, for example, a lot of dogs have hip problems and hip dysplasia and that sort of thing. Well, like German Shepherds, for example, are a good example of this. German Shepherds were bred to have that sort of front to back slant that is pretty common to German Shepherds and not to many other dogs. Well, it looks cool. It makes for a great show dog. It's terrible for that dog's hips. But because they're inbred over and over again, that problem just exacerbates itself with every generation. This is the most prominent, where you see this cause the most problems, is in what is called flat-faced dogs. So like pugs, English bulldogs, and especially French bulldogs, which are now the most popular dog in America because they're portable, they're adorable, they're easy to carry around, they're easy to take from one place to another. They don't need a ton of exercise. Those kind of flat-faced dogs, which we made cosmetically to kind of look more like us. And so we bred them over and over to have their normal elongated snouts get shorter and shorter and shorter. Well, as you might imagine, that causes some really bad respiratory issues. They have tongues that are too big for their mouths sometimes. The cartilage in there is kind of messed up over time. And so those dogs have a lot of breathing issues. As you know, probably if you've been around many French bulldogs or pugs, they snore a lot, which is kind of adorable to listen to, but it's also the symptom of a breathing problem. And because of that, French bulldogs, pugs, and all, they don't live very long, especially compared to, non-purebred dogs. In some countries, in Europe now, a few countries have sort of banned the breeding of those sorts of dogs because of those respiratory problems. But by and large, just as a bigger picture, purebreds are beautiful dogs. They are bred most of the time to behave very well. They're very great to have around the house, but they don't live as long. And sometimes, depending on the condition, they tend to suffer a little more than just your household mutt. And so that's one thing. If you're considering getting a purebred, they should really be careful to think about is what problems are you inheriting when you bring that dog in your house?
We have another question about the research you did for the book, and they're asking, other than personal observations and interviews, what other kind of research did you do for this particular book?
I read many scientific papers, books on dog behavior. This is a fairly recent field of study. Up until maybe 25 or 30 years ago, people just didn't think dogs were really worth studying. The people who did animal research did it mostly on either rats or animals where we think we could study their behavior closely, or like apes, because apes are closest to humans. But over the last 25 or 30 years, there's this a field called anthrozoology. I think I have that right. Um, that studies sort of human animal interactions. And, dogs are at the forefront of that. And so there are a lot of people out there doing some really interesting work in America and otherwise. If you're looking to read up on some of this, I would recommend an author named Alexandra Horowitz. She runs what's called the Dog Cognition Lab at Barnard College in New York. And she's written several really good books about what we know now about how dogs behave and how we relate to them and all that sort of thing. And so there's some of that research in the book. One of the things, I talk about happiness a lot in the book and how dogs make us happy and how we make them happy. One of the studies I remember seeing, and I think I mentioned in the book, is that when dogs and humans lock eyes with each other, they both get a dose of what's called oxytocin, which is a sort of a pleasure enzyme that we often get from a nice piece of music or seeing a friend or a beautiful letter, sort of something like that. And so we now understand that dogs and people literally are happy when they see each other. And so there's a lot of research, and I think obviously we don't understand a lot about how dogs think and behave. There's so much more we don't understand than what we do. And, but I think we're getting closer and closer to a real kind of comprehensive understanding of how dogs think and feel and how they react to us.
Something that I noticed when I was reading the book was you mentioned that you began to be able to tell which dogs were likely to win their groups the more shows that you started to attend. So I was wondering if you could talk about what was it about these winning dogs that you were noticing?
Again, it's the technical versus the sort of ethereal, I guess is the way I would put it. So even after I've been going to dog shows for a long time, I could not look at like 20 Airedales, for example, and figure out which one met the breed standard the closest. I just didn't have that kind of eye. But what I could tell was which dogs seemed to want to be there the most and which dogs were sort of enjoying their time in the show ring the most and which dogs had the most sort of zen-like ability, like I talked about with Striker, to sort of not be distracted by all the stuff that's going on around them. And so those dogs you could pick up fairly clearly. Like if you look at 20 dogs and maybe 18 of them are sort of anxious or they're, you know, seem a little spooked because there's all this noise and stuff going around them. And there's a couple of dogs that are just sort of zenned out and very calm and just taking it all in, or really seem to be enjoying the moment. Those are the dogs that would often win. And I think judges sense that sort of quality of like charisma or that Zen ability in the same way that I could, as a total layman, see that. And I think that tends to get rewarded, even to the exclusion a little bit of technical ability. And of course, for people who are really people who care about the letter of the law, that drives them crazy because they might have the most physically perfect dog and it might not win because it just doesn't have that sort of extra it or whatever it is. And those dogs tend to be rewarded a little more.
Hmm, interesting. We have another question. Is participating in the show circuit demanding on one's time and resources?
Oh boy, it's certainly at the top level, it's very demanding. So if you have, there's lots of levels to this. So there are lots of people who have dogs that they train on their own. They're what's called owner handlers. So they do both jobs. And there are lots of people in this world who might just take their dog to one or two shows a year. Like the dog show circuit comes to their town and they might show their dog there. And so they're doing some work to get the dog ready. They're showing the dog, and that might take a day or two, at the dog show. But they're not obsessive about it, and they're not traveling from town to town. So you can do this on a low level and have it be basically a hobby. The people who do it at the highest level, it ain't no hobby. Um, the top dog handlers are often showing 15 to 20 dogs at each show. And there are usually the shows come in clusters. So it'll be like a 4-day weekend, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday at the same place, but they would have 4 different shows. So it'd be like the Cleveland Kennel Club and the Akron Kennel Club, the Hudson Kennel Club. They would all, and most by and large, the same dogs would compete each day. They do that to sort of like pull their resources together. And so that's 4 days of competition, showing 15 to 20 dogs a day. And then these top handlers get in their RVs, drive to the next town, wherever that is. Sometimes they get a chance to go home for a day. Sometimes they don't. And then they start all over again. And they do that 48 to 50 weeks a year. So they're constantly on the road. And that is a hugely demanding job. So the top handlers, I said there's not a lot of money in this business. The only ones who really make much money are the handlers because they put in the work. And they put in like hundreds of hours a week on a typical dog show day, especially a prestigious show like Westminster. They might be up at 4:30 or 5 in the morning to walk the dogs, start them bathed and groomed. And those shows will often last till like 11:30 at night. So they're putting in like 15, 16 hours of work every day for the days of that show and then going on to the next town. So so the shorter answer is you can do this as a hobby, but if you want to really be good at it, it's a huge commitment.
Our next question is about handlers. Is it true that the handlers dress in drab or bland clothing so that the focus is more on the dog?
Yes and no. There's actually a division of viewpoints on this. Most handlers do dress in pretty drab clothes. So if you watch a dog show, it's very simple for the women, like skirt sets, for the men, like simple slacks and, you know, kind of khakis and button down kind of thing. There are some dog handlers who dress, like Elton John, basically, all spangly and sequins and things like that. They have a theory that their dogs might be remembered more if you see a fancy looking handler. Most handlers tend to believe that they want all the emphasis to be on the dog, and so they want to dress as unobtrusively as possible. And so that's what they do. But there are other issues with clothing in dog shows, especially for women. So there's a couple of issues. One is that no matter what they wear, they almost always have to wear flats because part of the job is they have to jog around the show ring. And so you can't really do that in heels. And so a lot of women in the world, a lot of female dog handlers sort of grumble about how they look dowdy because they're wearing these very nice clothes, but they're wearing these sort of clunky flat shoes for comfort. And so it's not a great looking ensemble a lot of times. But the other issue they have, and this again is more of an issue for the women, is where do you put the treats? Because they all have treats for their dogs. And as any woman in this audience knows, it's often hard to find good clothes with pockets. And so the women, anytime they find a certain outfit that somebody has on sale that has good pockets, they share that with all the other female handlers, they sometimes they stuff the treats like down their bra or something like that. And then handlers, male and female, often just, and this, I'm sorry, this is going to sound a little gross, they keep the treats in their mouths, like a chew of tobacco or something. And then as they're jogging around the ring, or they just pull out a little piece of cheese or whatever and feed it to the dog. So that's where to put the treats is a dilemma for every dog handler, but especially for the women. And that all ties into the clothes they wear.
What was it about Stryker and Laura that made you kind of want to follow them through their journey to Westminster?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I spent the first few months of reporting sort of um, auditioning, I guess, a bunch of handlers and dogs. So that it was important to me that the dog be a contender. Obviously, I couldn't know if it was going to win Westminster or not, but I wanted it to be a dog that I thought would have a good chance. And so every week in these trade magazines, they print a list of like the top 100 show dogs in America. And so I started with that list and started looking at the maybe 20 top dogs, who their handlers were, and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And then as I went to shows, I would start interviewing those folks. Some of them had no interest in talking to me at all. Others were super busy and just didn't feel like they had the time. Still others were interested, but maybe just not a great fit. They had a hard time articulating what they did and talking about it in a way that was useful to me as a writer. So when I met Laura, and she was immediately like super funny, super engaging, and most important to me, she understood what I was trying to do. I think my job in this book, and a lot of what I do as a journalist, I kind of see my job as a translator. So I go into this world that I don't know a lot about, other people might not know a lot about. I learn a lot about it, and then I come out and I tell you what it's like. Laura had that ability and that gift to sort of step outside the bubble and talk to me as a novice, and it kind of explained to me how that world worked. And she also had the detachment and sense of humor to sort of see the dog show world in its own absurdities, while she loved it all the same. So once I started talking to her, and she was able to articulate what this world meant to her, how it works, and how to look at it, how to understand it. Pretty clearly after talking to her, I thought, this is a person I need to spend time with. And so Laura and Stryker, their journey through this Westminster is sort of the narrative spine that the book follows.
And we'll end on kind of a fun question, a lighter question.
Good.
Someone was wondering, do you have a favorite dog breed and why?
Well, I tend to love sort of I've never been a hunter, but I tend to love the hunting dogs, the labs, the pointers, the setters, all those sort of like kind of big galoot kind of dogs that, lay down at your feet at the end of the day and that sort of thing. I will tell a quick story. There's a dog that's the state dog of North Carolina is called the Plot Hound. It's a dog that was brought over from Germany by German settlers into the mountains of North Carolina. A very brave dog that hunted big game like wild boars and things like that. Just these beautiful hunting dogs. I met a breeder of Plot Hounds one day. I went to see them, and he was telling me stories about their dogs. And he said, these dogs are beautiful. They are loyal. They're friendly. He said, not always the smartest dogs in the world. And he went on to tell me the story about one of his dogs, this dog named Bud. So where they live was kind of up in the mountains, and it got cold in the wintertime. And often the dog's water dishes would freeze overnight. And so Bob, this guy's owner, the breeder, would come out in the morning, and he'd break up the ice and he'd dump it out and he'd refill the water dishes. And so these be these chunks of ice laying around. And Bud, this one dog, loved to bury the chunks of ice like they were bones. And so he would spend the morning like burying these chunks of ice everywhere. And so the afternoon, as dogs do, he would come back to like dig up the chunks of ice. And of course, by then had warmed up and they were all gone. And he would go crazy. He would start barking and like, who stole my ice? And so those kind of big galoot dogs, those dogs that are friendly and loyal and sort of do dumb stuff occasionally too. I think I'm that type of person. And so my heart goes out to those dogs more than any.
Well, thank you so much, Tommy, for sharing all that you learned throughout this process. It's been really great to have you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'll just tell everybody on my way out the door. I'm pretty easy to find online. So if you had a question you wanted to ask and you didn't get to it, just email me, or the best way to reach me is through my newsletter. It's called The Writing Shed. It's free to sign up, easy to find online. Just look up Tommy Tomlinson newsletter and you'll find it there. And thanks to everybody for the great questions, for giving this space to me. And I hope you all read the book and enjoy it.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Um, just as a quick reminder, we have the link to purchase the book in the chat if you're interested. And then we also have some really great programs coming up the coming weeks in May. So feel free to check out our website to see all that we have to offer and sign up for our upcoming programs. So thank you again, Tommy. It's been wonderful to have you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.